This episode is brought to you by the RVA Podcast Network. Find more information at rvapodcast.org.
We do not own the rights to anything or any music that's heard during the duration of this podcast. Also, a lot of these shows will have explicit content. So if you are not a fan of any cursing or profanity, you may want to walk away, but that does not mean that every show will consist of such. Finally, this is the podcast every day in August. I almost messed up in saying April, but because I love this platform and I'm a creative, we are here to do what we do, and that is create content. So if you are not a follower or not a listener, please check me out on all podcast platforms: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Buzzsprout, Acast, Overcast, Stitcher, every podcast platform you can think of. This podcast is there. Continue listening. And this is The Past BT with your host, Brian, aka BT. The evaluation of estimation of the nature, quality, or ability of someone or something. Anytime you hear the word assessment, that definition is the last thing that comes into your mind. This is episode 296. This might be the first of many what I'm doing known as Podcast After Dark. I'm going to definitely be freestyling with this show, but I'm freestyling it for good reason. I'm going to be very transparent and very layer relaxed on this episode. The reason why is because if you were to ask me 5 years ago about doing self-assessments, I would have looked at you and laughed. Now, assessment is love, assessment is life for me. And I think why I carry it with such weight now than I used to is because, especially for Black men, and I can't speak for Black women because I'm not a woman, but for Black men, assessments are very important. When you're put in a position or in a space to really have to think of how you feel or where your mind is or where your heart is, where your spirit is, it really causes you to figure out where am I right now and where am I going? A lot of times the answer to either question is I don't know. I brought this conversation up before, and I think a matter of fact, it was on the episode yesterday for 295, where I brought up the age-old question where people come to you and ask, how are you doing? A lot of times our immediate answer is, I'm doing well, things are going good. But then there's the other challenge of, maybe I'm not as good as I think I am. And I'm fighting through trying to be good to get better. It becomes an ongoing and a constant algorithm of figuring out how you really are doing. Because sometimes people can ask you that question, which can lead to you automatically doing a self-assessment. Now, I gave you the definition of the word assessment, but now self-assessment is where it gets very broad, but very simple. When I previously did the recording for this podcast, I had a set of questions that are preset questions that you can ask someone based on their viewpoints and or perspective of self-assessment. It's just some general questions. But I also realized in doing that, it's not a requirement or a demand that you have to go that route and or avenue to do an assessment. Some assessments, whether we know it or not, are done in the most surprising ways or surprising manners. I was telling one of my friends today, one of the quickest yet simplest ways to do assessments are doing things that you enjoy doing, or doing things that you would never expect to do to generate or create ideas or thoughts to really make you think about who you are, how far you've come, where you're going, stuff like that. Now, I'm giving that broad statement, but I'm going to dumb it down, but not super dumb it down. A prime example of self-assessment is walking. If you really sit and just think to yourself, the last time you took a true walk, whether you had music, whether you had somebody with you, whether it was you and your thoughts, how much assessing or how much thinking did you do during that walk? You don't have to give an answer to me, obviously, but just something to really think about on your end as a person. Now I'm going to give the random assessment or self-assessment setting, and this will kind of really surprise you, but make you really look at it too. Gaming. A lot of people have had this idea and or thought that gaming is the most addictive thing. It's the worst thing in the world. I don't understand why people do it. It takes up so much of your time, so much of your life, etc., etc. I've heard it all. But as most people will say who have really been true gamers, gaming has kept them out of trouble. Gaming has kept them off the streets. Gaming brought me back to being Brian. Because at one point I was in the process of being Brian, but I wasn't ready to be Brian. I've used this term in my blogs, and I'm going to use it now as a cross reference. Assessments or self-assessments are reading the room, or is a form of reading the room. The difference is you're the only person in the room, and you have to read yourself. And that, for a lot of people, is one of the scariest, most challenging experience to encounter, because you're now being put in a position to really have to look at the man and or woman in the mirror. And that can be very challenging. I have had music sessions where I've listened to music, whether it's been binaural beats, solfeggio, classical music, lo-fi, heck, even some hip hop once in a while, and it's taken me into a thought process of where am I trying to go, or what am I trying to do? As I stated earlier, and as I want to emphasize in this podcast, assessments are not supposed to be easy. They're supposed to be uncomfortable. If you have been supporting the podcast or have listened to the podcast, I think I've done this 2, maybe 3 times. I went with a new format because most years when it's the end of the year, it's okay, let me get my laptop out. Let me just write all my thoughts out of everything that I've experienced in the year. I changed the format up and I decided to do a podcast of my year review. And wow, oh wow. You don't realize how much you experience until you really look at your own personal timeline in a podcast format and see how much you've done, how much you could have done, how much you think you didn't get done, but you really were in go mode, all of that. I've heard a lot of my friends who have been supported, by the way, I want to make sure I preface this and say, I'm so amazed and proud that you're doing a podcast every day for this month. And I always go back to her as an example because she was kind of my podcast inspiration. Ashley, who has been like, she was the reason I got back into Spotify. And I'm going to do a podcast about Spotify. I didn't forget. But I've just been doing other stuff. But she was doing a podcast every day, like for over a year. And it was like she would sit down, set up the mic, and go. And me looking at it then, I was like, I don't see how she can do it. But she did it. And it's a lot of it, if anything else, comes down to just your passion or your dedication to what you want to get done or accomplish. Another fellow podcaster, Siobhan, I hope she's okay with me getting her out there as far as being a creative. She is someone that's given me ideas out of the blue at the most perfect times. She actually just started a podcast. She just did her second episode on a show called Use Your Words. Awesome show. Definitely check it out. I'll put a link in the show notes regarding her show. But she was giving me a lot of gems and a lot of reminders of stop overwhelming yourself. Start learning how to do adult coloring. Do like between physically having a coloring book and do adult coloring, or just going with the old school route or going with the new school route of using an app and putting colors in. Like it makes time and life a lot smoother for some reason. When you're doing things like that, it's making you think because you're thinking outside of what you're doing, but also keeping your mind occupied. This is, like I said, this is a bit of a tangent podcast, but the point that I want to bring up is if you have not done so or haven't found the time to do so, work on doing a self-assessment. Your future will appreciate it. Your mental will appreciate it. Sometimes it just takes that right moment to really sit back and reflect. And I know I had Ramona on the show a couple weeks back. But it's so interesting where we were talking about doing the 300 prompts for writing, and she got the book and got going. And then I'm looking at my journal like, hi, how you been? I don't want to write anything because then that means I got to put more thoughts on paper. But that's another form of doing an assessment or doing a self-assessment. Even more important because I don't want to get too, like I said, I'm probably all over the place, but it's my podcast. I can do what the fuck I want. Explicit content, of course, by the way. I have had points where I was not aware of how often I was doing self-assessments. At first, they were kind of like a once in a while thing. Now it's almost every single day in the middle of conversations with people. And it's not in the middle of, oh, they said something, so it made me question myself, or maybe do an assessment in that manner. It was, I really need to look at me and know who I am. I've mentioned this on the show. I did this as Pass the Message yesterday. It's no benefit or no gain or growth to pour into someone else when you can't pour into yourself. Pouring into yourself is one of the best self-assessments you can do. So I like I said, I'm gonna wrap it up here, but and it's not me wrapping it up in like I'm trying to rush the show, but I want to make sure that I get as much content as I can. And like I said, Podcast After Dark. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, you trying to put on your sexy voice. No, it's none of that. It's just when you record late and you sipping water, like it's 2 in the afternoon, what you see is what you get. I will say, if you value who you are, where you're going, where you've been, you take moments like these and really disconnect. And I think that probably is one of the hardest things to do, especially with being in a very digital based society, is that we're so wanting to be connected when in reality the connections is what's causing us to ignore the issues at hand. And if that's the message I need to leave with y'all, fine. Focus on the matters at hand. Put the things that matter to you at the forefront, and let everything else fall as it may. And it's going to be uncomfortable, and it's going to be hard because a lot of us are very accustomed to being outpouring, being there, being available. But if you're not available to you, how can you be available to anybody else? Being available to you is one of the biggest, most powerful ways of doing assessments. And that's really what I got. So wrapping this show up, take time and think about when you've done your last self-assessment, and what did you learn from doing that assessment? Did it put you in the right mindset? Did it give you the right peace that you were looking for? Did you walk away understanding who you were and what you were about? And are you doing assessments frequently enough to not feel like you don't need to do them? Because I'm not sitting here saying we have to do them. If you choose not to do it, it's totally fine. But I notice in doing them and learning about me, learning about other people, reading the room of one, you get in a space where it's only fitting to just really look at everything and understand everything for what it is. And that's what I want to share. If you get nothing else, like, know what your purpose is in doing it, and don't just feel like you're doing it to go through the motions. Because if it's not being done with the right intentions, it's not going to be genuine. So that is all I have for today. Tomorrow, I'm going to check my calendar because I might have a topic written. If I don't, I think we're going to do a Spotify update, and I'm going to kind of talk about the facelifts and a few things some changes that I'm seeing and have noticed, especially in playlists, and like it's a lot that I'm going to get into about Spotify, because it's been my sanity without realizing it's been my sanity. So that's where we are. That's where we're at. I hope everyone enjoys. I hope everyone has a safe Sunday or Monday whenever you listen to the show. And as usual, this is The Path. Hey, y'all, we made it through another show, man. Hope y'all got through it. Hope y'all learned something, gained some new information, either about myself and or about podcasting. If you're looking to invest in podcasting, I have different ways of giving you the information and the tools to get you to the right direction with podding. I've currently switched from, anyone who remembers, I've been on Spreaker for years. I am a newborn in the Buzzsprout community, and I would definitely say it is one of my faves to use. And also, when it comes to audio, you do not need the most expensive microphone. All you need is a microphone that can catch your voice and can gather your words. So with that being said, this is The Path. I am your host, PT. Hope y'all enjoyed this episode, and we'll be back to do this again next time.